Hi, this is Sarah Hodges, and in this section we'll start talking about social psychology. This is my field of study, and when people ask what I do, I tell them I study normal, everyday behavior. That is, average people, not people with special psychological disorders, not babies or kids, and not people that have particular personality characteristics. So social psychology is just average people in social situations. Some of those situations may be ones that you've encountered, like these. Have you ever accepted a free sample and then bought something that you really didn't need, or maybe done something silly or dangerous with a group of friends that you had never done while you were alone? Perhaps seen a stranded motorist while driving down a busy highway, but you didn't stop to help. Or made negative remarks about members of another group after a member of that group got a job or a spot on a sports team or a scholarship that you wanted. Some people are surprised at their career studying something so mundane. Where's all the glamour? Where's your client on the couch? Where's the Hannibal Lecter-like crazy psychopath? Is normal behavior in social situations really something we need to study? Is it important? Is it really that interesting? Well, I'll argue that the answer to all three of those questions is yes, especially the last question. Many students are fascinated by the topics in social psychology and enjoy learning about them. And for the question, is it important? Well, everyday behavior has pretty important consequences because it occurs very frequently, like every day. The variables in social psychology are social variables, that is, variables that involve other people. Social psychology is the study of factors that affect how people perceive, influence, and relate to others. One of the recurring themes from the very start of social psychology is that the power of social contexts and situations influences our behaviors. That is, other people create social situations, and the mere presence of anyone changes things. How many of you might try some dance moves while you were alone that you would never do in front of anyone else? The presence of specific other people can also affect our behavior. So how many of you might do a particular dance move just to impress a particular person? Your behavior may also be affected by knowing you're in a particular situation, one that you believe other people would classify the same way. So you can think about, for example, how you might dance differently at a high school dance versus a dance audition. All of your decisions about when to dance and what moves to try, at least in part, are influenced by you trying to influence how other people perceive you. That's a big part of social psychology, how we perceive others and how we think they perceive us. Many social psychologists are drawn to the field because of strong social motives to make the world a better place, to prevent the uglier side of human behavior. In particular, many social psychologists were drawn to the field because they wanted to study stereotyping and prejudice, which is what we'll start with today in our discussion of social psychology. I'll start with what seems like kind of an obvious statement. We like people who are similar to us. We like people that have things in common with us, even if those things are kind of trivial. So, ever felt closer to a stranger when you found out that they were from your same hometown? Or maybe you felt closer to someone you found out shares your birthday, or someone whose mom has the same name as your mom does. Anyone out there have a mom named Judith? When it comes to more significant things, like having the same position on political issues, then we find that similarity really boosts liking. But you say, do we really need to pay social psychologists to tell us that we like people who are similar to us? Don't we all already know that birds of a feather flock together? Well, we also say that opposites attract, especially in romantic relationships. So which is it? Opposites attracting or birds of a feather? That is, similarity that lies at the root of attraction. Well, it turns out that birds generally beat out the opposites. But you probably know someone, maybe even yourself, who dated or was best friends with an opposite. And there are some studies that show complementarity, that is, opposites being attracted to each other. But that tends to occur later in relationships, not so much the part of initial attraction, and more a kind of as a division of labor. See, he likes to do dishes, and I like to do windows. Also, there's some suggestion that adolescents and young adults like to date people that are different from them just to shock their parents or demonstrate their independence. Maybe you all have heard about a couple named Romeo and Juliet. But it turns out that even Romeo and Juliet had a lot in common, despite the fact that they were from feuding families. So, not only do we like people who are similar to us, but we're also very good at categorizing people as being like us or not like us. Categorization is a very useful skill. You can think about it from an evolutionary point of view, about how categorization was critical for our survival in the early days of our ancestors. Categorizing, for example, which berries were poisonous and good. Categorizing which animals were good for eating and which animals were ones that were good to run away from. Which animals had good fur. What kind of clouds brought dangerous storms and which ones didn't. Turns out that our big old human brains are expertly tuned to categorize fast and well. This is very useful today. It helps us to process vast quantities of information that we encounter. So here's an analogy. It's kind of like having separate drawers for socks, t-shirts, and underwear. It's easier to keep everything straight than if we just had one big old bin that we kept our clothes in. There are some downsides, though, to being so quick and good at categorizing. Categorization lies at the root of stereotyping and prejudice. One of the most simple categorizations is whether people are a member of our group or not. Are they an us or are they a them? Groups that we belong to, those are in-groups. That's right, a group that we identify with. In contrast, the thems, people who aren't a part of our group, those are outgroup members, groups that we don't identify with. So, for all of you, if I were to ask you about the group students taking psychology, is that an outgroup or an in-group? Should be an in-group for all of you. If I said psychology majors as another group, that would be an in-group for some of you, but not for others. And if I asked about the group of double majors in astronomy and classics, it probably would be an outgroup for almost everybody listening to this lecture. Now, these distinctions may not be very central to your identity. You probably don't wake up each morning and count your lucky stars that you are a student taking psychology. But research shows us that it's remarkably easy to get an us versus them mentality going. Henri Tajfel, a social psychologist, and his colleagues got this us-them mentality going using very minimal criteria for dividing people into groups. So, these minimal groups were meaningless groups formed with strangers on the basis of very trivial criteria. So, for example, Tajfel and his colleagues would show participants paintings that they'd never seen before and ask them to choose which of the paintings they liked best. Tajfel and his colleagues told the participants that the paintings were painted by different painters and that they were going to divide the participants into groups depending on which painter they preferred. So, they divided the participants into groups, supposedly based on their preferences for the paintings. But in reality, they actually randomly assigned participants to one group or the other. Now, what does random assignment mean? That means that these participants had just as much chance of ending up in one group as they did in the other. And then the experiments asked the participants some questions. They asked them how much they liked the members of their own group versus the other group, and how they would allocate money to the two groups for participating in the study. Now, keep in mind, these participants never interacted with these other members of their group. And there was no real difference between their group and the other group because of random assignment. What other results did Tajfel find? Well, he found that the participants liked their group better, and they gave them more money for participating in the study. Now, is that really fair? All these people came to participate in the same study, they all did the same things, and yet people wanted to give their group members more money than members of the other groups. So, this is a pretty minimal group distinction. They divided participants into groups based on their preferences for a painter they hadn't heard of, and the other members of the group were strangers that they didn't know and never met, and yet the participants showed a bias in favor of them. I have another example of minimal groups now. It's what a teacher named Jane Elliott did with her elementary school class. Stop this lecture now and watch the video called The Eye of the Storm. Jane Elliott's work with these kids has become a classic. She's gone on and developed this exercise into diversity training that she does for corporations and in offices, and other places like that. Now, her original investigation in her class raises some ethical issues too. But the kids who participated in that initial classroom have been interviewed. Diane Sawyer did a follow-up a few years back, and most of them said that participating in this demonstration changed their lives. Perhaps you need a more recent example. This one's from an attempt to combine reality TV with a social psychology study. Stop this lecture now and watch the video clip called The Human Zoo. So, categorizing people into groups seems to be a big first step in discrimination and prejudice. Once people are categorized as in and out groups, then we can predict people's judgments about members of these groups. So first of all, who do we like better? In the Tajfel experiments, it was shown that people like in-group members better. But not only do we like in-group members better, we may actually derogate, that is, or cut down out-group members. Jenny Crocker found this by using a kind of group that occurs naturally on campuses. That is, she looked at different sororities. She found that sorority members tended to be critical of members of other sororities, and this critical nature was particularly present in women who were members of sororities that were not so highly respected on campus. Perhaps this was a way of making them feel better about themselves by putting down other groups. But not only do we cut down outgroup members, if you think about the kids in the video that you saw with Jane Elliott's class, they say things about the other group like they all do this or they all do that. This phenomenon is called outgroup homogeneity. It's a perception that outgroup members are all alike, and they're more similar to each other than they really are. And also that they are more similar to each other than members of the in-group are to each other. So the often uttered phrase by bigots of all sorts, "Oh, they are all alike," is representative of a tendency that we all have when we're thinking about outgroups. So, if you're from the West Coast, you probably think that all the people on the East Coast are in a hurry, people who wear suits to work and live in houses with white picket fences. You, on the other hand, think that West Coast people are diverse, varied, interesting. We allow our in-group to be more variable. We allow for various individual tastes, expressions of individuality, and that sort of thing in our in-groups. But we expect members of outgroups to be all alike. Now, to reverse this, what might East Coasters think of people from the West Coast? They would also show an outgroup homogeneity bias. They would think that everyone on the West Coast was laid back, wore sandals to work, and believed in New Age stuff. Research done right here at the University of Oregon examined outgroup homogeneity in an honors thesis that was done by undergraduate student Bernadette Park, who's now a professor at Colorado, along with her advisor at the time, retired U of O faculty member Mick Rothbart. These researchers showed that not only do we expect outgroup members to be more homogeneous, but we're also less likely to recall distinguishing information about outgroup members. So when you meet another in-group member, you are more likely to remember things like she was born in Idaho, she likes burritos, and she can do 117 sit-ups in a minute. More likely to remember those things about an in-group member than you would if you met someone who was a member of an outgroup. So, we're biased to learn more individuating information and remember it about in-group members, and this helps to keep our homogeneous view of outgroups homogeneous. We're also more likely to know information about in-group members for other reasons. We interact with them more, and we see a wide variety in their preferences, tastes, and styles, whereas we might not have this range of experiences with outgroups. The outgroup homogeneity effect has an interesting effect when it comes to criminal justice. In identifying crime suspects, eyewitnesses are much better at identifying members of their own race than they are members of another race. When they're looking at members of another race, when they're trying to identify someone of another race, well, everyone all looks the same. So, to sum things up so far, we like members of our own in-groups better. We're more likely to treat them better, and we think outgroup members are all alike, and we remember more individuating information about in-group members than outgroup members. If you need a break, this is a good time to take one. We'll come back and talk about stereotyping. Once we've categorized people into groups, it's an easy step to stereotyping. A stereotype is a generalization about a group of people. So, assuming physics majors are nerds, or people from the southern U.S. are going to be slow, or even assuming something positive about a group, like Italians are sexy. These are all stereotypes. And just like we as humans are very good at categorizing, we're also very good at stereotyping. You can see how stereotyping would be related to categorization. We put people in a category, and then we assume that all the members of that category have a common set of traits. Stereotyping has its benefits. Rather than process information about each individual separately, we can instead generalize from what we know about other members of that person's group. Stereotypes are kind of like a shortcut. They speed up our processing. However, like other shortcuts, they can sometimes get us in trouble. Have you ever been on the receiving end of a stereotype? You know, then, that it's probably not a very nice feeling to have someone jump to conclusions and take shortcuts in forming an opinion of you. It's especially not nice if the stereotype is a negative one and one that's inaccurate. However, so far, we've been talking as if there is at least a kernel of truth to stereotypes, that even though we may be wrong in categorizing some members of a group one way, there is still some truth to that stereotype, that our categorizations are correct more often than not. This is not necessarily true I'm going to tell you about some research that shows how stereotypes can be formed even in the absence of a kernel of truth, even without any evidence that a group has a tendency to be a particular way. That is, we tend to see relationships where they don't really exist. The study was done by Hamilton and Gifford back in 1976. In their study, they showed research participants behaviors that were performed by members of two different groups. So, for example, their participants read about George, a member of Group C, who complimented a waitress on her good service. Or they read about Michael, a member of Group T, who spent a summer doing an internship at the Capitol. They also read about some bad behaviors that group members did. So, for example, one of the group members hit his pet dog because he was angry. Now, the ratio of good to bad behaviors for both groups was the same. That is, Group C did 24 behaviors total. 16 of those behaviors were positive, things like visiting a retirement home once a week. 8 of the behaviors were negative, things like not giving out any Halloween treats. For Group T, there were 12 behaviors total. 8 of them were positive and 4 were negative. Thus, for each group, participants saw that 2/3 of the behaviors were positive and 1/3 were negative. Yet, when Hamilton and Gifford looked at their results, and this has been found in many replications, they found that people tended to prefer Group C. Why is this? It's a phenomenon known as an illusory correlation. We tend to see correlations between unusual or distinctive characteristics and unusual or distinctive groups. Group T was more distinctive or unusual. That's because there were fewer members of Group T. The participants in the study saw less information about them. They read less about them. Seeing a behavior by a member of Group T, the more distinctive group, was a rarer event, whereas behaviors performed by Group C that was more common. Now, which were more common, negative behaviors or positive behaviors? If you think back, there were more positive behaviors. So, negative behaviors were also more distinctive. The majority of behaviors were positive, 2/3 of the behaviors were positive, so negative behaviors were rarer. They were more distinctive. People tend to overestimate the number of times that they see distinctive behaviors paired with a distinctive group. So, when there's a distinctive group paired with a distinctive behavior, or a pairing of two distinctive events of any kind, this tends to result in people seeing a correlation where there might not really be one. In Hamilton and Gifford's work, people were pretty good at estimating how many positive and negative behaviors they saw for the majority group. That is, Group C, the group that was seen more often. Their participants were able to correctly estimate that they saw about 2/3 positive behaviors for this group and 1/3 negative. But the participants were not as good at estimating the behaviors for the minority group, that is the group for whom they saw fewer behaviors. Here, they overestimated the number of negative behaviors, that is, they estimated that it was more than 1/3 of the total behaviors, and they underestimated the number of positive behaviors, that is, they thought it was less than 2/3 of the total behaviors. But remember, mathematically, there was no correlation between group membership and whether a behavior was positive or negative. Knowing whether a particular behavior was performed by a member of Group C or Group T would not help you predict whether the behavior they performed was positive or negative. In both cases, you had a 2/3 chance of being right if you predicted the behavior was positive, and a 1/3 chance of being right if you predicted that it was negative. Now notice, this is not just an example of saying that correlation does not equal causality, something that you may remember hearing from the section on research methods. Here, there isn't even a correlation. There's no predictive ability. But we as people do have a natural tendency to see relationships where there's not really one. Illusory correlations occur for things other than group behaviors. For example, there's a belief that wacky things will happen on nights that have full moons. Wacky things and full moons, they're both pretty rare. Thus, there's a tendency to see an illusory correlation. Now, illusory correlations are bad news for groups in the minority. Minority groups are, by definition, more distinctive. They're a minority. They're rarer. There are fewer of them. But, you might argue, couldn't there be an illusory correlation between more distinctive groups and more distinctive positive behaviors? It could happen. But there's a reason why this is less likely than seeing an illusory correlation between a minority group and negative behaviors. Negative behaviors tend to be more distinctive than positive behaviors. That is, negative behaviors stand out. People generally behave themselves. It is when they misbehave that we take note. So, a member of a minority, say a female student at a military academy, or a blonde person in China, or the one person who plays triangle in the marching band, whenever they commit a faux pas, when they make a mistake, because of illusory correlations, people will connect this distinctive behavior, making a mistake, with the distinctive group. Those blonde people, those triangle players. Thus, illusory correlations explain how stereotypes can be formed, even when there is absolutely no relationship between a characteristic and that group. So, how a stereotype may be formed even when there is no kernel of truth. So stereotypes may be formed for no good reason, just because a group is distinctive or in the minority. Or in other cases, stereotypes may be formed because there is some truth to them. But once formed, stereotypes have powerful effects. For one, they contribute to the confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is when we have expectations about a particular group that shape what we see that group doing. We see what we expect to do. We interpret what we see as what we expected to see. Thus, if we see a table of biochemistry majors that are sitting together in the library, we see it as an example of how studious they are. If we see a table of sorority and fraternity members sitting together in the library, we see it as an example of how they are always socializing. Same behavior, sitting there at the table in the library, but a very different interpretation based on our expectations about the group. But things go beyond a mere confirmation bias. There's also something known as the self-fulfilling prophecy. Not only do we see what we expect to see, but we also create the behavior we expect to see. So this is a difference. This is not just our perceptions. It's not just that we're seeing what we expect to see, but we actually have a way of changing other people's behaviors so that they fulfill the prophecy. So suppose someone tells you that people from the Czech Republic are totally fun to date. You meet someone of your preferred gender from the Czech Republic. Now, how are you likely to behave around them? Because of your expectation, you're lively, you're flirty. Well, what happens? Well, this Czech guy or gal thinks you're coming on to them. They respond by smiling. Oh, maybe they ask you out. The relationship is off to a wonderful start. Now, why is this a self-fulfilling prophecy? Because the way you behaved changed the way the Czech person behaved. There's an example of this in a classic social psychology study that was done by Snyder, Tanke Berscheid. They showed male subjects pictures of a person and said, you're going to talk to this person on the phone. Now the pictures that they saw were either pictures of an attractive female or an unattractive female. But the pictures were not really of the person that they were actually going to talk to. Instead, the researchers randomly assigned participants in the study to either see a picture of an attractive person or an unattractive person. Then the phone calls start. The participants talk on the phone with the person that they think they're seeing a picture of. And sure enough, these male participants treat the woman on the other line differently depending on which picture they saw. If they saw the picture of the unattractive woman, they give shorter and duller answers. If they saw the picture of the attractive woman, their answers are more lively and more animated. They're more sociable. They're warmer. But the most striking result in the study was how the men's behavior changed how women on the other end of the line behaved. So even though the pictures weren't of real women, there were real women on the other end of the phone line. Now these poor women, they don't know that a picture of someone else has been shown to the male participants. But when they are talking with these guys on the phone, what do they hear? They either hear a really interested guy because he thinks he's talking to someone who's hot, or they hear a guy who seems kind of bored and wants to end the conversation because he thinks she's not hot. And so the women respond in kind. As a second part of the study, the researchers then took just the women's part of the conversation from the audio tapes, and then they played it for a new second group of research participants. Now, some of the participants in this second group rated women who had been talking with a man who thought they were attractive, and some of the participants rated women who were talking with a man who thought they were unattractive. When the participants heard a woman who had been talking with a man who thought they were attractive, these second group of participants rated those women as more confident, more likely to be attractive, and again, this is just from the audio, they didn't have any way of seeing them. They also rated the women as more lively, animated, and warm. And this is compared to the group of participants who were listening to women who were talking with a man who thought she was ugly. Now remember, the second group of participants, they never saw any pictures. A few years later, Susan Anderson and Sandra Bem, two other social psychologists, reran the study. In this case, they switched the roles. They had females who saw the pictures of either ugly or attractive males. They found the same influence on behavior and the same results for people who listened to just the audio. So it's a pretty powerful effect. Now, more recently, researchers, especially Claude Steele of Stanford, have identified a different form of self-fulfilling prophecy that has a slightly different root. It's known as stereotype threat. This is a concern among members of negatively stereotyped groups that their performance will confirm a stereotype about their group. The problem is that their additional concern about confirming the stereotype does interfere with their performance. So, a female student at a math contest is afraid that if she does badly, it will confirm people's beliefs that women can't do math. Or an African American student can be afraid of confirming the stereotype that African American students aren't as smart as white students. This added stress of worrying about confirming the stereotypes actually makes them do worse. In other words, the stereotype is confirmed because members of the stereotype group are worried. They're anxious about doing badly, and the anxiety interferes with their performance. Now, how do we know this is the case? And it's not just that women really are worse at math than men, or that African Americans are not as smart as whites. Here's how we know. When we tell women that the math test isn't a measure of their performance, when we say things like, oh, nobody will ever see your individual score, then they do no differently than the men. Or if we don't ask African American students to indicate their race at the beginning of the test, their scores go up. It's only when they know that their scores will be identified with them and that their performance can be seen as representative of their minority group. That's when we see stereotype threat, with the accompanying negative influence on performance. Now, many social psychology researchers who began the early scientific study of stereotyping were motivated because of the treatment of and prejudice against African Americans in this country. But this work has since been extended and has implications for all groups. In many ways, this work studying stereotyping and prejudice is social psychology's gift to the world. We have a better understanding of prejudice and stereotyping, why it happens, the cognitive processes involved, and even how it can be reduced. But again, you might be asking, do we really need social psychology? Can't we all just get along? Social psychologists have investigated the contact hypothesis, the idea that prejudice will be reduced if different groups just have a chance to interact with each other. But is it that simple? No. Research into this phenomenon, both research done in laboratory studies and studies of such contact out in the real world, suggests that there are a number of conditions in order for contact to work. One of these conditions is that the contact has to be between people of equal status. If the only contact you ever have with another group is that they are always your boss or you are always their boss, it's a lot harder to reduce prejudice. The second thing is that the contact has to involve actual personal interactions. It's not enough just to watch, for example, a friendly interaction between groups that occurs on TV. A third condition is that contact works best when people are engaged in cooperative activities. That is, like, for example, when they're all trying to save the planet, or they're all trying to work together to add a music program at the local school. Finally, and fourth, contact works best when social norms are in favor of reducing prejudice. There needs to be social pressure for people to believe that getting along with people from other groups is a good thing. So, getting along with other groups and reducing prejudice and discrimination is a complicated problem, and it's one that continues to perplex our society. But it's a complex problem that social psychology research has helped us to understand better.